Dr. Anthony Fauci, a man who has overseen one of the greatest overreaches of power that we have seen in America in our lifetimes, is doing his level best to try and protect his tattered legacy. Dr. Fauci is trying to teach us about viruses and why the COVID-19 vaccines are limited. This, mind you, is the same man who once told the American people that criticizing him was the same as criticizing science. Why? Well, naturally because Fauci represented science. And that was just dangerous to criticize. Well, apparently not anymore, and that's a problem for good old Dr. Fauci, because you see, according to the good doctor, any problem with the vaccines isn't the fault of the government or the medical industry. No, it's the fault of the big bad RNA virus, that pesky, misbehaving little COVID-19. Well, that is going to be the subject of today's episode, and so from Trial Site News, I am Adrian, and our episode is starting right now. Now, Fauci, in his exit, teamed up with two infectious disease colleagues from the NIH, David Morens and Jeffrey Taubenberger, to educate the world on why the current COVID-19 vaccines were not sufficient to take on the respiratory disease known as SARS-CoV-2. You see, after decades of Fauci and team studying these viruses, and after all that we have collectively gone through, this horribly divisive mandates and other pandemic-driven madness, which culminated in freedoms being robbed from countless millions of people, the trio of authors have now issued a report on why places like the NIH will need more money to develop the next generation of vaccines. Trust us, they say, they are the science. See, according to Dr. Fauci, and I'm just going to paraphrase all of this here, everything was a success. We saved countless lives and even partially controlled the pandemic. But any problems with the vaccine isn't the fault of the government or industry, it is the fault of that bad RNA virus. You see, the virus has mutated just like influenza, a dynamic, by the way, which they had known about for decades, but for whatever reasons just forgot about during the onset of SARS-CoV-2, which has now rendered the vaccines less effective. And the trio is taking advantage of this. They are pouncing on the Omicron mutations, looking at it as an opportunity to get a pass for what has been a truly questionable, if not outright failed, vaccination strategy. Now, Dr. Fauci and team outright acknowledge that all coronaviruses, like influenza and the common cold, replicate in the human respiratory mucosa without infecting systematically. Now, this is problematic, you see. The NIH, which helped promote and develop the vaccines, didn't focus on this target-rich area. They were fully aware of all of this as they embarked on the great COVID-19 pandemic response countermeasure effort. And yet, they somehow failed to capitalize on their knowledge. But that's not all. Dr. Fauci and his team pointed out that because these viruses generally do not elicit complete and durable protective immunity by themselves, they haven't to date been effectively controlled or licensed by experimental vaccines. Now, none of this is surprising to us. See, we here at Trial Site News from the very start of the pandemic challenged Fauci and the NIH as well as the World Health Organization's notion that they could control and eradicate an RNA virus such as the novel coronavirus with a blood-based vaccine, or any vaccine for that matter. Just go back and read the many, many articles that we wrote on TrialSiteNews.com since 2020 on this topic. The influenza virus in many ways is similar. And that vaccine has been hit or miss for decades. We have never managed to eradicate it. Yet, based on a whim and a hope with novel technology, entire health systems backed by a government emergency decree deployed $5.5 trillion in U.S. taxpayer money alone over nearly a 3-year period to, among other things, vaccinate 70% of the population. So what do you think is the solution here? Well, these three men of science indicate where they want to go, their true calling. The development of next-generation vaccines against these viruses. The authors are suggesting next-level considerations from antigen configuration, dose, and adjunction to route and timing to boosting and other options for public health vaccination policies. Now, this is nice of them to finally admit what we've known for a couple of years now, that these current vaccines are in reality a version 1.0. Dr. Fauci knew well in advance that the status quo would not be sufficient. In fact, here is what he said about it. After more than 60 years of experience with influenza vaccines, very little improvement in vaccine prevention of infection has been noted. As pointed out decades ago and still true today, the rates of effectiveness of our best approved influenza vaccines would be inadequate for licensure of most other vaccine-preventable diseases. Even decades-long efforts to develop better so-called universal influenza vaccines that would create more broadly protective immunity, preferably lasting over longer time periods, have not yet resulted in next-generation broadly protective vaccines, although a large number of experimental vaccines are in preclinical or early clinical development. Now, this is all well and good, but I remember a time when they promised the world that if we just got vaccinated, that everything would return to normal. Now, naturally, Fauci must defend his less-than-stellar pandemic response by going on the offense, shielding his mass vaccination scheme, not to mention the terribly divisive and mismanaged response. Remember the endless lockdowns, the destruction of freedoms? I sure do. It would appear that Mr. Science, Dr. Fauci, exploited the pandemic for exactly the reason he mentioned in this piece, that there has been essentially no innovation and associated breakthroughs in vaccine development for over half a century. Thus, we can see why there is such a huge emphasis on mRNA technology, which represents significant potential if only given more time and scientific breakthroughs. But no, they rushed the countermeasures response. They shamelessly exploited the pandemic for the greater good. All you have to do is read Moderna's investor disclosures as late as December 2019. It is true that mRNA initiatives were ongoing for the past couple of decades, but these products remained highly experimental and still very early stages when considering possible commercialization of the technology. As Moderna put it, we don't know what we don't know, so investors be aware. Now, this is important because the entire mainstream press and government agencies bashed anyone who reported on vaccine injuries, especially in the early days of the vaccine rollout. But despite the attempt to stop anyone from talking about it, it didn't stop vaccine injuries from occurring, even if they are now still deemed rare. We estimate that there is anywhere from 500,000 upwards of 2 million people in the US alone who are having material residual problems associated with the COVID-19 vaccines. We suspect anywhere between 10 and 30,000 people have died from reactions that likely were associated with the countermeasures. Of course, the vaccines were developed to induce antibodies and protect people from the SARS-CoV-2 surges, and they worked for a while anyway. But as we've clearly seen over the past several years, they were not perfect, and it is outrageous that government, medical industry, and academic medicine are running away from their accountability. Which then takes us back to Fauci. Apparently, one cannot let any good crisis go to waste, and Dr. Fauci took full advantage of the death and destruction that followed in the wake of the pandemic. He capitalized on the pandemic for innovation, for massive economic development, and ultimately wealth accumulation for systemic players. All you need do is follow the money, and in the case of COVID-19, $5.5 trillion and counting. Now, Fauci is working overtime to save his legacy. He is continuing to claim that the vaccine saved innumerable lives and helped to achieve early partial pandemic control. Now, perhaps you can give Fauci partial credit for the first point, that the vaccine in surges, if administered correctly, helped soften the blow of the pandemic. But on the latter point, that it somehow had helped in achieving partial control of the pandemic, complete and utter nonsense. Statements like this only further reveal Dr. Fauci for what he truly is: a bureaucratic medical hustler. If he knew the science, he would have known in the first place that the vaccines would not be able to keep up with the mutating RNA coronavirus. He would have known that they would not be sterilizing, and that they would lack breadth and durability. We here at Trial Site News had been discussing this very thing for a long time. How come we knew this, and not the apex research institute of the world? Dr. Fauci and colleagues are finally admitting that the COVID-19 vaccines are deficient, now conveniently remembering the science behind these viruses. They are finally admitting that much like influenza and the common cold, coronaviruses mutate, which is why they've had such a tough time coming up with controlling vaccines in the first place. Again, what happened to this scientific knowledge in early 2020? It was there, we knew about it. In this way, his words in his recent paper are meant to explain away and rationalize the largely failed vaccination program. This is important because not only was there substantial limitations of the accelerated countermeasures, but people like Fauci made it impossible for any frontline initiatives to take place. It was all about do nothing until the vaccines get here. Anything that might have helped against the raging pandemic was shut down and crushed. Pfizer, backed by the government, serving as the promotional engine, the legitimizer, if you will, shut down any frontline initiatives in the clinic early on to use repurposed medicines to help save lives. A prime example of this would be the IMAC protocol. A pharmacist came up with a life-saving protocol during the summer of 2020, inclusive of blood thinners and steroids among other elements. A small local Florida newspaper reported on the matter, and then we here at Trial Site News published a piece on it, and it went viral. Hundreds of thousands of people read the article, which in turn led to the shutting down of the protocol. The pharmacist that came up with the protocol would then lose her job. We have been told by insiders that due to contracts with Pfizer, the health system's employees were not allowed to do anything to save lives that the pharmaceutical company would have deemed competitive with the vaccine, which at the time was in clinical trials. All of this, of course, we find highly unethical, and this wasn't the only protocol shut down. I'm sure you all can think of a few. While the federal government's various agencies are quick to calculate with the help of academia how many lives they have saved with the vaccines, albeit in temporary surges, they don't calculate how many lives they terminated with their policies stopping early efforts to help treat people. No, that wouldn't look good. Now, ultimately, Dr. Fauci served as a frontman for the medical research complex, helping to direct which products would have a better probability of clearing largely NIH-funded clinical trials. It is important to note that Fauci isn't some supervillain here. He's just your typical bureaucrat, albeit a powerful one. But he didn't have the power to oversee the entire pandemic response apparatus, its vast federal division of labor, with its questionable countermeasure vaccines and therapeutics. He was a spokesperson, a figurehead, although one wielding clout within the federal agency. The pandemic response is a reflection of a deeply rooted systemic problem. And apex research institutes such as the NIH or even the WHO have become ever increasingly tied into medical industry because that's how drugs get developed. But industry depends on investors, higher stock prices, lots of sales and growth. Pharmaceutical companies cannot move into novel products that don't produce substantial returns or profits. And Fauci is a child of this system, and he knows no other way of life. And this, of course, is a crying shame. Generic companies could have been mobilized with the $5.5 trillion in taxpayer money that was redistributed during the pandemic. But I guess that's for another day. The problems encountered during the pandemic are systemic and require broad reforms, including a redirection of substantial public investment in true healthcare, meaning proactive ways to help us get healthier. So let's bring this back into Dr. Fauci. Did he really assume that the COVID-19 vaccines would be durable, knowing that the underlying virus would continuously mutate, because that's what coronaviruses do? Or did he somehow forget his basic science 101 for COVID-19? Pushing investigational products with limited shelf life as part of a broader innovation agenda? Or perhaps was it something else entirely? Worth thinking on. And that, my friends, will bring our episode to a close once more. As always, thank you so much for joining me on the program today. For more content like this, be sure to check back to this channel daily, Monday through Friday, or for written articles every day, 7 days a week, check us out at trialsitenews.com. From Trial Site News, I am Adrian, and I will see you all next time.